Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Um, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Innovation in Linguistic Talk series presented by the journal Cognitive Semantics. I'm Zorong Gao from Beihang University, and an editorial assistant of the journal. I'm honored to host the 22nd lecture in this series. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to our journal. And Cognitive Semantics is a peer-reviewed international journal focusing on exploring the relationship between meaning and mind. We welcome submissions of unpublished research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. And thanks to the sponsorship from Beihang University, COSE has now transactioned to an open access journal. As a result, papers published in COSE are freely accessible to scholars all over the ground. From Beihang University, the journal's consulting editor including Professor George Lakoff, Ronald Laecker, and Leonard Telmy. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin, and our associate editors are Professor Martin Hilper, Professor Francisco Reyes Mendoza, and Professor Veronica Kohler. We are supported by a dedicated team of editorial assistants, including Dr. Liu Na from Central China Normal University, and Li Zifan, Yang Yuhang, and myself from Beihang University. And today we are honored to welcome Professor Kasper Boye to give a lecture, who is a professor of linguistics at University of Copenhagen, taking a functional, cognitive, and usage-based approach to language structures. His main research interests include grammaticalization, layered semantic structure, linguistic categorization, and complementation. Professor Boye is the author of Epistemic Meaning, a cross-linguistic and functional cognitive study, published in 2012, and have co-edited two influential books, that is, Language Usage and Language Structure in 2010, and Complementary Semantics in European Languages in 2016. So now let's welcome Professor Boye to give his lectures titled What is Grammar? From Agrammaticalization to Grammaticalization.
Thank you very much, Zheran Gao, for this kind introduction.
Thank you, Professor.
I would like also to thank Professor Thomas Lee and the Cognitive Semantics Journal very much for inviting me to give a talk in this very inspiring series, the Innovation in Linguistics series. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And I would also like to thank Stefan Lee from one of the editorial assistants, for organizing everything so professionally and kindly. Unfortunately, Stefan Lee is ill now, as I understand. I will now share my slides. And can you see? I hope you can all see them.
Yeah, now I can see.
Great. That's good. And then I just need to get, this away. Good. So the title of the talk is, as already mentioned, What is Grammar? From Agrammatism to Grammaticalization. And I'm going to give a usage-based, cognitive, functional, linguistic answer to this question. And we start by considering the question in more detail. So why is it an important question what grammar is? Well, one thing is that most of the things that make human life special depend on complex language. This includes societal structure, spiritual life, including arts and religion, and also, of course, science. The ability to deal with the basic conditions for human experience depends on complex language. And complex language typically has grammar. Sorry, I just have one small problem here that I can't go to the next slide. One moment.
Yeah,
It works now. It works.
now it
Good.
works.
Thanks. Okay. A second reason why this is an important question is that grammar may be lost or impaired. And in order to help people with grammatical impairment, we need to know what exactly grammatical impairment is. And this implies that we need to know what grammar is. A third reason, and there are many other reasons, is that grammar is, and this is perhaps the most important one, is that grammar is one of the relatively few things that distinguish human beings from our closest relatives. And it probably played a central role in the evolutionary success of the human species. So even our closest relatives among the primates, namely, for instance, bonobos, chimpanzees, they are not really able to learn much grammar, even if we train them, and they don't use grammar at all, probably in nature. It's also a difficult question. The question, what is grammar, is also a difficult question. And why is this? It is because grammar is a complex phenomenon, and it's complex in several dimensions. And one source of complexity is that grammar is often taken to comprise two sets of phenomena, both what we could call grammatical elements or grammatical words or affixes, grammatical morphemes and words. And also, on the other hand, it also comprises what we could call rules or schemata, or what we could call syntax and morphology. So while the lexicon only consists of elements, grammar both consists of elements. For instance, grammatical elements are affixes like is in cars, articles like the in the man, and auxiliaries like have in the woman has stopped the car, or the car has stopped. On the other hand, grammar is also, as mentioned, rules or schemata for the formation of, for instance, noun phrases and clauses. So did the car stop is based in many languages. This English structure has a fixed word order. Many languages have fixed word orders, and these are clear evidence of constructions. So this is a challenge. So if you want to understand what grammar is, you both have to understand what rules or schemata or constructions are, and also what grammatical elements are. Construction grammar gives makes one good attempt at capturing both. A second source of complexity, however, is that grammar is also at the same time a neurocognitive phenomenon, something it's an ability that is supported by certain brain areas, including Broadman area 44, also part of a Broca's area, and it gives rise, grammatical deviations give rise to certain fluctuation patterns in ERP. But at the same time, it's also a social phenomenon. So it's both an individual neurocognitive phenomenon, and it's a group phenomenon, a social phenomenon. So grammar is also something that obeys the social laws of community phenomena, including this S-curve model of social spread of innovations across the community. I'll get back to this later. So what is grammar as a social and neurocognitive phenomenon? Well, dominant approaches to grammar are, I think, far from an answer. Generative linguistics, on the one hand, ignores social aspects and focuses on the capacity for generating structure by combining elements 2 by 2. This is what they call universal grammar or merge. So they ignore all social aspects as what they call e-language. Construction grammar instead downplays the special nature of grammar, focusing instead on the joint status of grammatical and lexical elements as Saussurean signs, that is what they call constructions. For this reason, research on grammar generally relies on traditional pre-theoretical definitions that don't work. And I'll try to demonstrate this by going through a couple of definitions and a couple of traditional definitions. And one, perhaps the most widespread, is that widespread one is the paradigmatic distinction between grammatical and lexical as a distinction between closed class membership and open class membership. So grammatical items are all the items that belong to closed classes, and lexical items are all the classes that belong to open classes. There are several problems here, namely firstly that we can find closed classes with members that are uncontroversially lexical, for instance, numerals, proper names in certain language, for instance, Latin, prenominals, and also adjectives in some languages. An even worse problem for this position is that classes that comprise both grammatical and lexical subclasses exist. For instance, classes of affixes, pronouns, adverbs, and adpositions. These have on several occasions been argued to contain both lexical and grammatical members, and there's even neurolinguistic and psycholinguistic support of these claims. I'll get back to this also. So another this traditional distinction is a semantic distinction according to which grammatical is what is functional and lexical is what is contentful or contentful. There are several problems with this. For instance, firstly, of course, it's a problem to what does this distinction between functional and contentful really mean? For modern usage-based cognitive linguistics, all meaning is basically instructional, procedural, so there's no really big difference between contentful and functional. Another more empirically based problem is that conceptually or functionally similar grammatical lexical pairs exist. So in other words, in many cases, we can have basically the same concept or function expressed both by grammatical means and by lexical means. One example of this is possession, which can be expressed lexically by means of a verb, as in Bob has or owns a car, and also grammatically. In Bob's car is a grammatical element indicating possession, but in 1a, possession is indicated by a lexical verb. Same goes for illocutionary value. You can say, I order you to go away, indicating or expressing the lexical directive. You can express the directive meaning lexically by means of the performative verb order, as in 2a. Or we can express it in other ways, namely grammatically, by means in English of a special imperative construction, go away, the imperative construction. In other languages, we have imperative particles, for instance. This could also be said of many other things about evidentiality, epistemic modality, and also even number. For instance, there's not much difference between the number 2 and the dual marker in languages that have a dual marker. The only difference is that you have a lexical and grammatical contrast. A third definition that does not work is the complex definition in terms of sets of features, where grammatical is taken to be equal to something that is phonologically and semantically reduced, for instance, and then other features are also mentioned. Lexical, on the other hand, are items that are phonologically and semantically non-reduced. And the problems here have been pointed out by Campbell in particular, and Brian Joseph and Frederick Neumeyer in 2001. And basically, the problems can be boiled down to these two ones, namely, firstly, not all features are present in all cases of grammar. So you can easily have grammar that is not really phonologically or semantically reduced in any clear sense. And also the second problem, some features are found also outside grammar. For instance, phonological reduction is found also in many lexical signs. So based on this, I will now try to give a solution to these problems, a theory that does not share these problems. So I'll first outline the theory, then I'll briefly go through a number of experiments in which we tested implications of the theory. And then I will also quite briefly go through an account of grammatical impairment according to our theory and a new way of understanding grammatical impairment. Then I will go on to discuss grammaticalization. And based on that discussion, I will continue discussing the lexical grammatical continuum. So to which extent do we have a clear distinction between lexical and grammatical? And finally, if we have time, I would like to discuss the raison d'etre of grammar. Why do we have grammar in light of this usage-based theory? So first, the usage-based theory of what grammar is. The central claim is that grammar belongs along those means languages have for coordinating attention to parts of complex messages between speaker and hearer. So in languages, we have foregrounding devices such as focus markers. It is Marie that I like, where we foreground Marie by means of a cleft construction. We also have backgrounding devices such as parenthetical clauses. Marie is nice, I think. Or we could also have the parentheses of the written language, of course. Yeah. So the claim is more precisely that grammar is conventionalized attentional background status. So grammar is a means for signaling background information. This means that there are two main ingredients in the theory. There's attention and there's convention. And by means of the attention component, we can capture the neurocognitive aspects of grammar. And by means of the convention component, we can capture the social aspects of grammar. And I'm here referring back to my initial remarks that grammar is both a social phenomenon, which is something we agree on in the language community. It's also a neurocognitive phenomenon, of course. So first, attention. What is attention? Well, we can just give these two really nice definitions. One definition is that attention is a state in which cognitive resources are focused on certain aspects of the environment rather than others. And a really fine definition is here. Another one, which is compatible with the first one, is that attention is the management of limitations in the brain's information processing capacity. So because we have limited processing capacity, we need to process. We cannot process the entire, all the inputs we get at the same time. We need to prioritize. And this is what attention does for us. It prioritizes our processing resources. So this basically means that if we look at a rather relatively unstructured painting, for instance, and we have only short time, we can focus here. This is Bruegel the Elder painting where he depicts different ways of children's play. And you can look at one children game here, child game, or you can look at another one, or the first one again, but we cannot see them all. Or the third one, we cannot see them, we cannot process it all. We need time to process it all, and if we don't have time, we need to focus our attention on part of the painting. And this is basically a context dependent. This prioritization is context dependent. So we have completely the same in complex language and even in very relatively simple language, but still complex language, which is complex in the sense that it is composed of more meanings and more words, or more morphemes at least. And a simple example of this is avoid swimming. And even in this case, we will we will concentrate on part of the message and make the other part of the message background in relation to the foregrounded message. So, for instance, if we discuss attitudes towards swimming, one person could say, I like swimming, and the other one could say, I also like it. And then there's one person saying, avoid swimming. And then avoid would be the main point, the attentionally foregrounded point of the message. Swimming would be background. Because swimming is the topic and it's redundant. In other contexts, however, swimming would be the main point. For instance, if we're talking about things to avoid, and some person say avoid smoking or avoid flying, and then a third person could say avoid swimming, and then swimming would be the main point here, and avoid would just be background information. So it's basically context dependent. It depends on what people talk about. So a wide range of linguistic phenomena have to do with coordinating attention between speaker and hearer. This has been all these different ways have been mapped to some extent by Lentalmi. So I'm basically in line with Lentalmi's idea here. So the specific way that of discourse, the specific type of discourse prominence. So linguistic attention phenomena can also be called discourse prominence, and the specific type of discourse prominence we're after here is what we could call syntagmatic discourse prominence, where we consider the relative prominence of parts of a complex linguistic whole. So that is the attentional prominence a meaning or sign has relative to another meaning or sign in the same syntax, in the same message, in the same phrase, or in the same clause. We can distinguish two different values here because we can simply consider attention as a relative notion. So we can say something that is foregrounded is what is the most prominent element in the syntagm or in the message, and what is background is a less prominent element in the syntagm or in the message. And I have also used the terms discourse primary and discourse secondary for this. So that was attention. But what about convention? This is the second ingredient in our theory. What is convention? Well, convention is a community level phenomenon, and I understand it in line with Searle, Lewis, and Clark as first a state of coordination between the members of a community. So it's above individual level. It's something. It's a social fact. It's not an individual level fact. And you can understand this social fact and the link between individual and social facts in terms of what Searle calls collective intentionality and what he more precisely could call a collective intentional status assignment. We agree as part of a community that something counts as something else. X counts as Y. For instance, car counts as an expression of a motorized vehicle on typically 4 wheels. So it's a social fact. It's not just the sum of individual status assignments or entrenchments, as some cognitive linguists tend to claim. So now we have what we need in order to define lexical and grammatical elements. We are, of course, interested in the grammatical elements, but we define them in contrast to lexical ones. So lexical elements are meanings, morphemes, words, or constructions that are by convention potentially attentionally foregrounded. So lexical elements are like avoid and swimming that have the potential to, dependent on the context, be attentionally foregrounded. In contrast, grammatical elements are by convention attentionally backgrounded. That is, they can, by convention, if we adhere to the speech, to the language conventions, they cannot be the attentional main point of a phrase or a syntagm or a message, except in metalinguistic context where conventions are overridden. So in contrast to our avoid swimming example, consider this example with an apple. Here, an apple will always be foregrounded. It's impossible to foreground an, except in metalinguistic context where people misunderstood you and you have to say an apple. I said an apple, not an apple or the apple. So here, so this is because an is a grammatical element. It is conventionally backgrounded, so we don't expect to pay much attention to it or to make it the main part of our conversation. So this, when we in these few cases, metalinguistic cases where we foregrounded, this can be compared to another convention where we write. In this case, it's English. They write in the left side of the car, in the left side of the street, and this is the convention in England. If you go to England, you have to write on the left side of the road. But occasionally you can break the convention and go to the right side for a short period. Break conventions in order to make traffic run smoothly. And by the same basic principle, you can occasionally foreground grammatical elements like "an" in order to make conversation smooth. So this means that there's this relationship between conventional potential, so the language potential, and language usage. Grammatical elements are conventionalized with one of the two possible discourse prominence values of lexical elements. So lexical elements, they can be attentionally foregrounded or attentionally backgrounded. There are two lines here. Grammatical elements only have one of these two options. They can only be attentionally backgrounded. We can then wonder what is the functional rationale behind the grammatical versus lexical contrast. And it can be put like this. The contrast helps us coordinating linguistic attention. It helps us decide which part of a linguistic message to direct our attention towards. So if you hear the following sentence in English, and if you know the conventions of the English language, then you know what to do about it. So the sentence is like this: the student had always wanted to see the palace. And if you hear the sentence and know the conventions of English, you know immediately that you can superficially process all the red stuff, all the grammatical stuff, including the schematic constructions, and you can then concentrate your processing resources on the blue stuff, on all the lexical stuff, because all the lexical stuff is what is potentially foregrounded. So you know by just briefly looking at this sentence, then you can prioritize your processing effort. So you first do a superficial scanning, and then you find out, okay, what should I process more deeply here, and what can I do superficially? So basically, grammar is like some conventions that arrive in some genres and periods of painting. So here's a famous painting by Velázquez, a Spanish Baroque painter, and you can see. So this painting is called Las Meninas, and it's about this princess and her maids. And the painter here uses black color in order to signal what is background and light color in order to signal what is foreground. So you can consider grammar is like the black background. It says we need this information, but it's not the main information. It's not you shouldn't process this too deeply. Although there are some interesting, but we'll get back to this. There are some interesting elements in the background. So the painter focuses foregrounds by means of light colors, the princess and her maids. Okay, so now there are two central properties of grammatical elements. We have already said that they are attentionally backgrounded. This is the definition. They are attentionally backgrounded in relation to other elements. We could call these other elements hosts. From this, it follows that they are also dependent on combination with other elements or hosts due to their background status. So because they are backgrounded, they need something that can be foregrounded to be combined with. Because you cannot have backgrounds on their own, it doesn't make sense. So you cannot have a piece of music for background violins, for instance, for second violins. Second violins only make sense relative to first violins. Similarly, in language, you cannot say is, for instance, the plural is or it, the past tense it, or the article a in isolation. You cannot, if you want to say if somebody asks you if you already did the dishes and you wanted to say yes, I did in the past, you cannot just say it, because it is a grammatical element. It's backgrounded, and because it's backgrounded, it needs to be combined. Presupposes a foregroundable element to be combined with something relative to which it is backgrounded. Another implication of this theory is that meaning is the basic level of analysis. So attentional backgroundedness in the relevant sense here is basically a property a meaning can have. So a linguistic sign, a linguistic word, or a morpheme, or construction is grammatical if it only has grammatical meaning. And one example of this is it, the past tense it. It only has grammatical meaning. It simply means past tense. It is backgrounded, and therefore it is grammatical. In contrast, a sign is lexical by virtue of lexical meaning, but a lexical sign may additionally have grammatical meaning. And an example of this is ran, which has two meanings at least, namely, firstly, the run meaning, which is lexical, and by virtue of this, of which the whole word can be foregrounded and is lexical. But it also has a past tense meaning, and this past tense meaning is grammatical, but it's another meaning of a totality that is as a total whole lexical due to its lexical meaning. So there's some hierarchy here. This theory captures uncontroversial cases of grammatical elements. If it did not, it wouldn't be a theory of grammatical status, but of something else. So for instance, standard average European, SAE, standards average European inflections and articles are attentionally backgrounded by convention. This is pretty clear. And so are schematic syntactic constructions. If you take interrogatives, for instance, of course, it's nice to know that people are asking a question, but the main point of asking a question is to ask a question about something. It's the content of the question that is attentionally foregrounded. The question meaning is backgrounded relative to the proposition or the entity that is being questioned. And in order to see this, you can set up a thought experiment where you try to get rid of the question meaning, and then people can, if you just write a word on a piece of paper, then people can, in the right context, figure out that this word is questioned. But you cannot just write a question mark and then in the right context, then it would be, you would need more contextual cues in order to figure out what this question mark concerns, what the lexical content is. In some cases, the theory is at odds with traditional pre-theoretical ideas of what grammar is. And this can, of course, be used to test the theory against other theories or ideas. For instance, pronouns, appositions, and affixes may be either lexical or grammatical based on this theory, and I'll get back to this later. Whereas in traditional understandings of grammar, these closed classes are all grammatical. So we can now reconsider our conceptually functional similar grammatical lexical pairs that we looked at before. So we considered possession and also illocutionary value as concepts or functions that can be expressed both lexically and grammatical. And what does it really mean to express them grammatical and lexical? Then we can answer this question now. So we can say that when possession is expressed lexically as in 1a, it means that we potentially foreground the concept of possession. Whereas when we express possession by means of a grammatical clitic, as in 1b, we background this concept. Pardon. The same goes for illocutionary value. We can foreground or potentially foreground directive illocutionary value by expressing it by means of a performative verb as in 2a order, or we can background the directive meaning by expressing it by means of a schematic construction as in 2b, or in other languages by means of a grammatical particle or affix. So in order to summarize this theory, I will briefly spend 2 slides on positioning it in the theoretical landscape. What I have said implies that grammar is not a distinct kind of phenomena. This is opposed to what is believed in generative grammar, where grammar is seen as a completely unique kind of phenomena, a capacity for combining elements 2 by 2. In this theory is usage-based and functional and cognitive. In that it sees both grammar and the lexicon as consisting of signs and meanings. But this does not mean that that grammar cannot be distinguished from other phenomena. And this actually runs against mainstream usage-based linguistics. So this theory entails that grammar differs from the lexicon in terms of conventionalized potential for attention. And also grammar differs from from backgrounded information in the contextual information from background inferences in terms of conventional status. So grammar is something special here, according to this theory. So the theory is basically all basic elements are in all basic respects, it is a usage-based theory, but it departs from mainstream usage-based linguistics in positing a rather strict distinction between lexicon and grammar. So another implication here is that grammar is neither an innate capacity, this is as opposed to what is believed in generative grammar, nor a simple response to frequency or predictability. This is opposed to what some strengths and usage-based linguistics would claim. Rather, according to this theory, grammar is the solution to a problem that arose when our ancestors began to combine simple messages into complex ones. Because when you get complexity, you get a challenge to your processing resources, and then you need to economize them. And this is exactly what grammar does. It helps us coordinating what should be backgrounded, where we can save processing resources and only process superficially. So grammar is something that arises when we have complexity, and it arises as a solution to the problems raised by complexity. A final thing I'd like to say about the theory is that it entails diagnostic criteria. And these criteria are not something that we have derived based solely on this theory. These criteria have been noted before, but for instance, by Bybee, Perkins, and Pagliuca, and by Evelyn Kaiser. What our theory does is that it actually provides a common joint theoretical motivation for these criteria. People have just mentioned them as empirical facts, although they have discussed them in absence of a theory of what grammar really is. But we can now say with this theory that why these criteria are actually there. And the criteria are that since lexical elements are potentially foregrounded, they can be focused, they can be addressed. That is, you can ask about these elements in subsequent discourse, or you can comment on them, and they can be elaborated through modification. In contrast, grammatical elements cannot. I will illustrate these criteria, and we can start with the focusability criterion. This criterion explores that grammar points out what is not the attentional main point, namely what is backgrounded, while focus points out what is the attentional main point, what is foregrounded. So this means that there's an incompatibility between grammatical status and focus. So we can use this focusability criterion to show that numerals are lexical, whereas, at least in English, whereas articles are grammatical. So one is lexical, it can be focused. So you can say, I have, if in a sentence like one bicycle, you could focus one by saying exactly one bicycle. Or you could say it is one that I have. In contrast, the focalize by means of exactly, as in to be, for instance. So this shows that based on this focusability criterion, one is lexical and is grammatical. We knew that already, but now we have theoretically anchored criteria to show it. The second example here will illustrate the modifiability criterion, and we can use our example as our example. We can use the distinction between lexical go, the motion or intention verb, and grammatical gonna, the future or prospective auxiliary. Go is lexical and it can be modified. So if you say, I'm going to resign, then by means of secretly, we can modify go. So if you say, I'm secretly going to resign, then secretly can semantically modify. So this is all about semantics. It can semantically modify go. I'm going in a secret way. Gonna, in contrast, is grammatical. It cannot be modified. You cannot, if you say, I'm secretly gonna resign, this cannot mean I'm gonna in a secret way. It can only mean resign in a secret way. And of course, you could argue that this is just because secretly is a manner adverb and doesn't, manner adverbs don't work on auxiliaries. But then I would turn that argument upside down and say, okay, but why then do we not have any adverbs or anything else that can modify auxiliaries? And the reason why we don't is that auxiliaries are not meant for being modified because they are grammatical. They are backgrounded, and therefore they cannot be elaborated and made foregrounded. There are some limitations to these criteria. So I'm not saying that I'm solving all problems here, all empirical problems. Firstly, they depend on language-specific means for focusing, addressing, modifying, and not all languages have all possible means. Excuse me. Secondly, means for focusing are mostly limited to constituent level elements. So this means that in a lot of grammatical elements that are below constituent level, for instance, prepositions, cannot be tested by means of focusing. A third point here is that the criteria of grammatical status are negative. So you can show that something is lexical by showing that it's either focusable, or it can be addressed, or it can be modified. But in order to show that something is grammatical, you have to show that it can neither be focused or nor addressed nor modified. And this means, of course, that it's a little hard to show that something is definitely grammatical. Also, people have asked me, so isn't it annoying that grammar here is defined negatively by the absence of focusability, addressability, and modifiability, by the absence of attention? And I think, well, this is a fact of nature because this follows directly from the fact that attention is also asymmetric. So the absence of attention is defined negatively. Background is defined negatively. Relatively is defined relative to the notion of foreground. And because we define grammar, because we understand grammar as something that is backgrounded, we inherit from the notion of attention this asymmetry by which we define foreground status or attention as something positive and absence of attention as something that is not there. A fourth limitation is that due to the continuous nature of splitting and conventionalization, application of the criteria may give unclear results. And splitting is, we will get back to this later, splitting is the continuum in which a lexical source gives rise to a grammatical descent. And these two things will divert, they will split only gradually. I will get back to this and also to the conventionalization S-curve later. I'll just give two examples of how we can apply the criteria. They sometimes support hypotheses that run counter to established theoretical assumptions and provide them with a theoretical anchor. For instance, some prepositions, notably in European language, have been shown to be more affected than others in aphasia, in agrammatic aphasia. Those that are more affected are grammatical by our criteria. So we have shown this again and again, and this is also some old works by Federici, generative neurolinguist, and some Dutch guys also. So some prepositions can be modified so you can say right before. And before is lexical, and before is relatively spared in people in the speech of people who have grammatical problems because it's lexical. In contrast, grammatical prepositions, an example of this is for. They did it for her. You cannot say right for her in the same way as you can say right before her. So by this criterion, the modifiability criterion, 4 is grammatical, and 4 these grammatical prepositions are more affected in the speech of persons with grammatical impairment than the lexical prepositions. Another example is the idea that affixes may be lexical. And this is an old typological idea. Marianne Mithun has written about it. We have recently done some studies on it, including a letter detection study that shows that some affixes attract more attention than others. And one example of lexical affix here is in Kalaallisut, Inuit language spoken in Greenland. And here you have Pingitsu Nerayua Sinavok. And this sentence, you can, by means of you are, continuously, you can modify nera, say, which is an affix, but actually it's a verb, but it's an affixed verb. So this continuously can modify say. So one affix modifies another affix, and the affix that is modified, namely say, is by our criterion, therefore lexical. And we can show that by means of eye tracking study, we can show that these kinds of affixes attract more attention than the grammatical affixes. And this is what I'm going to now. So now I'm finished with outlining the theory, and I'll instead go through how we can test it. And I'll do that quite briefly. So we can do that in language perception, language production, and agrammatic speech. And I will briefly say something about each of these. We have done experiments in all of these areas. In language perception, we can derive the hypothesis that because grammatical signs are by convention attentionally backgrounded, they attract less attention than lexical signs in language perception. We already know this, of course, because this motivates why grammatical words are often reduced phonologically, or morphemes in general. Because if we know that they're background information, we don't need speakers. We know that the hearers will process them superficially, and therefore, as speakers, we can invest less articulatory resources. We can save some articulatory resources. We can reduce phonologically because they're backgrounded. Okay, but we can test this in different ways in change blindness, in letter detection, and eye tracking. We did all of this. I'll just give you a letter detection example. Please look at the following sentence. And it's a small sentence. Please find out what it means. And also count all the instances of the letter F. So count all the instances of the letter F while simultaneously reading the sentence. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, so that's it. How many Fs did you find? Many of you probably found around 3. So there's an F in finished and in files, and also in the scientific. These Fs are all easy to detect because they're in lexical elements, whereas there are 3 more Fs actually that many of you probably overlooked, and these are the Fs found in of years, of scientific, and of years again here. And of course, these Fs are not pronounced as F. This can be one reason. Also, they're in very frequent words. This is not predictable words. This is another reason. But also, these ofs are all grammatical, so they are intended as background information. Therefore, you will skip them when you process the sentence. And because you skip them, you don't detect the Fs. So such a simple experiment can be used to measure attention to different parts of messages. And we used this experiment. We designed some text where we contrasted Danish prepositions, but they correspond to the contrast between English before and for that we already talked about. Before is modifiable, so it's lexical, and for is grammatical. It's non-modifiable. And the prediction is that participants pay more attention to lexical prepositions than to grammatical prepositions, and therefore they find more instances of R in prepositions classified as lexical than in prepositions classified as grammatical. And this is what we found for Danish. So here you can see the miss rates. So people missed around 60% of the R's in grammatical prepositions, but only 40% of the R is in lexical prepositions. Now to language production. In language production, the central prediction is that because grammatical items are attentionally backgrounded and dependent on combination, they will be associated with more errors and longer reaction times. And this is highly controversial, of course, because normally people would think that grammar is all the automatic stuff and that's easy to make. But we say that because grammar is background information, also needs combination with something else, it will actually be a little more difficult. So we tested these hypotheses in different experiments. One of the experiments was where we contrasted near homonymous articles and numerals. So we contrasted basically in Danish again, but corresponding to the article in a red letter and the lexical numeral in one red letter. So we had a grammatical article and a lexical numeral. And we made an experiment where we asked people where we elicited these two elements, numerals and articles. So in one condition, the lexical condition where we elicited numerals, we showed people, for instance, two letters, and then we said, I have two red letters. They heard a voice saying, I have two red letters. And then they heard a question, how many do you have? And then when they saw a picture of one red letter, they had to say one red letter. So they produced the numeral here. In the grammatical condition, they first saw a green letter and heard the sentence, I have a green letter. Then they heard an elicitation question, what do you have? And then when they saw a red letter, they had to answer the question, and they answered it by a red letter, producing the article. And we could measure this difference between articles and numerals. So we measured error rates, how many errors did they produce, and also we were especially interested in the response times from the elicitation, from when they saw the red letter to when they started producing the sentence to voice onset. So in the first experiment, we actually didn't find any overall difference, but we found for the fast speakers, we found a hypothesis that the hypothesis was confirmed. The fastest speakers may be assumed to reflect canonical processing most accurately, and they actually showed longer reaction times for grammatical determiners. For grammatical articles, where it took longer time for the fast speakers to produce. For the slow speakers, there was the opposite effect, but this is probably due to an enormous confound, namely frequency. So grammatical articles are much, much more frequent than lexical numerals. So probably for the slow speakers, this opposite effect was driven by frequency. We did other experiments where there were no frequency difference between lexical and grammatical, and here we found clear effects that confirmed our hypothesis. In another experiment, we did the same basic experiment, but then we added a working memory load. So we asked people, this is called a digit span task. We asked people to remember a series of numbers, of digits, while simultaneously doing this. And because they have their working memory overloaded, then it started producing errors, even though this task is very, very easy. So in the grammatical condition, you could see that they actually produced 3 times as many errors as in the lexical conditions. And in the lexical conditions, actually most of these 30 errors that they produced were disfluencies. So these were basically hesitations and stuff like that. Whereas in the grammatical condition, most of the errors they produced were omissions. So that they basically omitted the article. And this is similar to what we find in agrammatic speech. And agrammatic speech, or more generally grammatically impaired speech, there's an example of this here. A person with aphasia, a grammatic aphasia, is trying to describe the Cinderella story. And you can see here, this person says, Cinderella scrubbing and hard worker, stepfather go, but no scrubbing, what shall I call it, working. You can see there are very few grammatical words. There are almost no articles. There are no articles and little, if any, grammatical words, except for some conjunctions and perhaps a negation. So this is acquired grammatical impairment due to brain damage in podcast area. The central prediction is that items classified as grammatical are underproduced in grammatical impaired speech when compared to neurotypical speech. And we did one study of this where the prepositions that we also studied in our letter detection study. And we could see that in non-fluent aphasia, which is associated with grammatical problems. Okay, first we can look at the controls. Incidentally, they produce around 50% of grammatical prepositions and 50% of lexical prepositions. The people with grammatical problems are the people with non-fluent aphasia. They underproduce heavily the prepositions classified as grammatical. In contrast, the people with fluent aphasia that are often roughly taken to have lexical retrieval problems, they overproduce the grammatical prepositions and underproduce the lexical prepositions. So here we can see that this completely fits with our letter detection results, that there's a distinction between lexical and grammatical. Another example, sorry about this, we took the same experiment as before and asked people with grammar problems to go through this experiment, a modified version of it. So, and here are our results. So people with agrammatic speakers, people with grammatical problems due to brain damage, omit grammatical determinants. They omit the article but not the lexical numeral. And so you can see in the aphasia group here, the lexical numeral this is almost always produced, it's very close to zero, whereas the grammatical article is left out in 1/3 of the cases. In the control condition, among the control persons, you can see there's no omissions at all. There are no omissions at all. This is a very easy task. So to sum up, these experiments, perception studies show that grammatical elements attract less attention than lexical ones. The production studies show that grammatical elements require an extra processing effort and that they can be dispensed with in case of resource limitations. And one interpretation of this can be cast in terms of what has been called audience design. So language is designed for the benefit of the audience. Grammar requires an extra cost for speakers, but it helps listeners prioritize information in terms of attention and thus save resources. Based on this, this theory can now give an account of grammatical impairment. And this is based on a recent paper by me and Silvia Martinez Ferreiro, Roland Bastianse, and Peter Harder. According to our theory, there are two ways of understanding grammatical impairment. In one way, grammatical impairment is a consequence of an impaired neurocognitive capacity for combination. Grammatical signs, they signal communicative background. This is what our definition is. From this, it follows that they depend on combination with other potentially foreground signs. And this means that if we have an impaired neurocognitive capacity for sign combination, they will be selectively affected. Grammatical elements will be selectively affected because they require combination. So if this hypothesis is correct, we would expect that grammatical impairment is also associated with problems with lexical signs that require combination. Not only grammatical signs, but also, for instance, adpositions, lexical adpositions. And this is what we found in the study. Another way of understanding grammatical impairment, what has been called agrammatism or agrammatic aphasia, is that it is a compensatory response to cognitive resource reduction. So again, here the reasoning goes like this. Grammatical signs signal communicative background. This is by our definition. From this, it follows that they can be omitted or produced inaccurately without fatal communicative consequences. So consider again our sentence, the student had always wanted to see the palace. This means that we can omit the background information, all the grammatical information, and in the right context, you could still find out what this sentence was about, namely that the student always wanted to see the palace. You can even do so if you scramble, if you also remove the schematic, syntactic structure, the construction, you can also, in the right context, and if you have some time, you can still figure out what the sentence is about. But you cannot if you delete all the foreground stuff. If you only have the grammatical stuff, it's impossible to find out what the sentence is about. So if this hypothesis is correct, we would expect that grammatical impairment is also associated with problems with lexical signs that are attentionally backgrounded. And this is actually what we found in the experiment I talked about just before, where we did this one versus a contrast on people with aphasia. When people produced in the grammatical variant where they had to say a red letter, this red actually was actually more preserved. The adjective was more preserved here. It was sometimes omitted here, where the attentional main point is one, because people are asked about the number. So here they attended some people had problems with the adjective where they had to produce one, but when they just had to say where the color was important, there was no problem in producing the adjective. Okay, note that these two hypotheses are mutually compatible. Grammatical impairment is a consequence of an impaired neurocognitive capacity for combination, and grammatical impairment is a compensatory response to cognitive resource reduction. These two hypotheses are mutually compatible. So an obvious candidate for firstly, the capacity for combination mentioned in hypothesis 1, and also for the resource mentioned in hypothesis 2 is working memory. We rely on working memory for combining things, and if we have a reduced resource, it could very well be our working memory resource. There's a lot of neuro linguistic evidence to support this idea. I will now go to our user-space theory of grammaticalization. And based on our theory of what grammar is, we can define grammaticalization as the conventionalization of attentional background or discourse secondary stages. So we say that grammar is conventionalized background stages, and this means that grammaticalization can be straightforward, defined as a conventionalization process by which background status becomes conventionalized. So grammaticalization is the process by which an attentionally backgrounded meaning, because meaning is what it's all about, becomes conventionally, and not only contextually, conventionally associated with a given expression. So the form-meaning relationship becomes conventionalized. And I have developed this theory into recent publications that I have listed here. So this definition does not share the problems of mainstream approaches. For instance, firstly, it is based on a coherent theory of what it means to be grammatical. It's not based on these standard definitions that we went through to begin with. For instance, the definition according to which grammar is all the closed class members. Instead, here it's based on a coherent theory of what it means to be grammatical. Also, it's process-oriented. Some other definitions of grammaticalization do not really attempt to understand grammaticalization. Instead, they simply say grammar is something that results in, grammaticalization is something that results in something that is grammatical. So they sort of postpone the problem and say we just need to understand what is grammatical, then we can understand grammaticalization. This is actually the case with our own theory from 2012. In my paper with Peter Harder, we also define grammaticalization in terms of its result, not really as a process. In other cases, grammaticalization are understood. Okay, grammaticalization is generally understood as it defined. We have had difficulties understanding what kind of process is grammaticalization. So the entailment by this definition I just proposed here is that grammaticalization is a distinct type of a well-known kind of change, namely conventionalization. This excludes epiphenomenal status, so this protects grammaticalization theory from the attacks made by generative linguists. And a fourth way in which, and a fourth problem that this definition does not share is that the definition defines grammaticalization as a single change that is part of the larger set of interwoven changes. And this it does not inherit the problems of much grammaticalization research, namely that grammaticalization is taken to cover far too much. So take an example of this, namely the development of English going to, or the auxiliary gonna from going. This development consists first first you have a construction where you take go and you construct it or construe it with a purposive infinitive. I'm going in order to resign. And when you do this, then because purposes are always later than when you have the purpose, you have the purposes, you have a future meaning inference. So this is an inference that follows from the fact that you have go plus purposive infinitive. And then you conventionalize this backgrounded future meaning. This is a future meaning. There's a future meaning inference that follows from the purposive. And at some point, this becomes conventionalized. So this future meaning becomes conventionally rather than contextually associated with the form going to. And you can see there's a so-called switch context here where you can see that the conventionalization has occurred. Now you can also use going to express future, where there's nobody that could have a purpose. So there's no purpose meaning any longer. It's just the future meaning. So this is a so-called switch context, which witnesses conventionalization of the erstwhile inference. And then finally, you get phonological reduction. So there are lots of things going on here, and this is even simplified. A lot more things are going on in the development of Ghana. What I wanted to say here is that in standard grammaticalization theory, people tend to think that everything from the point of departure to Ghana is grammaticalization. But according to the theory that I've presented, only one step here is grammaticalization, namely the conventionalization of background to future meaning. So this means that we can get a much more precise definition of grammaticalization. This means that this definition is not vulnerable to attacks, according to which people say, okay, but phonological reduction is not grammaticalization, so why do you include this as grammaticalization? No, I completely agree. Only conventionalization of background and future meaning. Background status is grammaticalization. So instead of linking grammaticalization to characteristic features such as bleaching and reduction by definition, the present approach invites us to ask why these features frequently accompany grammaticalization. And a fifth thing is that it does not only cover the delexicalization type of grammaticalization, but also syntaxicization and grammaticalization by way of borrowing. But due to time concerns, I will have to skip this argument. Then there are some implications of the theory that I would like to briefly go through. Namely, firstly, there are four implications, and the first one is that there are more implications, but there are four that I would like to go through. And the first one is that grammaticalization is basically a meaning change. What is conventionalized as intentionally backgrounded is basically a meaning. A sign or a word or affix is only intentionally backgrounded by convention by virtue of its meaning. A second implication is that grammaticalization can be identified by means of theoretically anchored criteria. So since lexical elements are potentially foregrounded, they can be focused, addressed in subsequent discourse, and or elaborated through modification, whereas grammatical elements cannot. So if we have the source and a target of a diachronic change, then we can test whether the source is lexical and whether the target is grammatical. And we can then diagnose grammaticalization. A third implication okay, we have already seen an example of this. The third implication is that this theory based on the definition given earlier has explanatory power. For instance, we can use this theory to understand why grammatical morphemes tend to become bound. And of course, this is a natural consequence of the fact that they are backgrounded, because we have already discussed that because they're backgrounded, they need to be combined with something that can be background relative to, and this is already this dependent upon combination with something else is exactly what boundedness is about. It also motivates why grammatical morphemes tend to be phonologically reduced. And this is, of course, we have already talked about this. When I, as a speaker, want to say something to you, then I know that all my grammatical stuff you will process superficially. So this means that I don't need to I don't need to be as articulate or as accurate in pronouncing these grammatical items. I can skip some of, I can allocate some of my processing resources to the lexical stuff. This means that I can phonologically reduce the grammatical stuff, and you will still understand my main points. It also motivates why grammatical meanings are often general or bleached, and this is a longer discussion, but basically one of the ideas is that the backgrounds you can argue here by analogy that the backgrounds of paintings are often also devoid of the contours or the precision that you find in the foreground of paintings. So you don't need the same level of detail in the background as in the foreground, and this means that the backgrounds will be more general or bleached. And finally, it explains why novel metaphor does not undergo grammaticalization. And argued this together with Ane Thy and Leonard Westergaard. And the basic argument here is that novel metaphor is a means for attracting attention. And this, of course, makes it incompatible with grammaticalization, because grammaticalization exactly conventionalizes what is not attended to. And there's general agreement in the grammaticalization literature that novel metaphor is incompatible with grammaticalization, but now we have an explanation. The fourth implication is that grammaticalization is a continuous process to the extent that conventionalization is a continuous process. So, and here I'd like to end, and I'll take up this final point in the next section. This does not mean that there is any such thing as a lexical grammatical continuum. And this is what I'm going to argue now, where I'll try to deconstruct the lexical grammatical continuum. So here, again, recall implication 4, grammaticalization is a continuous process to the extent that conventionalization is a continuous process, because grammaticalization is a special case of conventionalization, according to our definition. Excuse me. So, but this does not mean that there's any such thing as a lexical grammatical continuum. And this is what I'm going to argue now. Namely, I'm going to argue that a lexical grammatical continuum or client does not exist. But it is clear that grammaticalization is embedded in a number of other continua that can be mistaken for a lexical grammatical continuum. But we don't need a theoretical lexical grammatical continuum, because there are lots of continua already. So this is what I'm going to argue. So there are some examples of this. There's examples of other continua in which lexical grammaticalization or the lexical, examples of other continua in which grammaticalization is embedded are a social level conventionalization continuum, a splitting continuum, a discourse provenance continuum, and a lexicon syntax continuum. And I'll go through the three of these, because the third one you have to read about that in my recent publications. It simply takes too long time to go through that argumentation. So the social level continuum, the social level conventionalization continuum is a built-in feature of the proposed definition of grammaticalization. We say that grammaticalization is the conventionalization of attentional background status. And conventionalization grammaticalization is then a continuous process because conventionalization is a continuous process. And both the local, and I'm here relying on the work of Herb Clark, both the creation of local conventions and also the propagation of these conventions across the speech community, which goes gradually, is a continuous process. So this propagation, for instance, of new conventions follow this S-curve, as does much fashion. So there are some innovators that early, you can see this in the x-axis, there's time, and in the y-axis, we have the percentage of the speech community. So there are first some innovators that innovate a new convention, and then gradually this convention is spread through society, and eventually the curve flattens out, not because there are some conservative people who are reluctant to take over the new conventions, but because these conservative people actually die, and therefore there's no, therefore eventually the convention will spread over the whole, may spread over the whole community. This social level conventionalization continuum is not a lexical grammatical continuum. It does not apply to the lexical grammatical distinction, but rather to the distinction between something that is non-conventional, for instance, the inference, the future inference of going to something. So it applies to the distinction between something non-conventional, context-dependent on the one hand, and something conventional on the other hand, and therefore to the conventionalization of an originally non-conventional element. So this has nothing to do with a lexical grammatical continuum. The second continuum that has been discussed in terms of in relationship to grammaticalization is this, what has been called split divergence or layering, also the A-B-B scenario. So this describes, this is relevant to much linguistic change. So you first have an A, and based on A, you derive a B, and then A and B coexist together, and then A may disappear, and then you only have B. So this also goes for grammaticalization. So where you develop a new grammatical element, it does not mean that the original lexical source disappears. For instance, we developed a new the grammatical have, the auxiliary have in English coexists with the lexical source of that auxiliary, namely the possession verb in I have a car. So here you have a gradually split. So first you have two different meaning variants perhaps, and then you get a distributional difference, and then finally you get a phonological difference, as in the case of gonna. But this takes time, and you only gradually get a longer and longer, more and more differences between the lexical source and the grammatical descendant. So this is this divergence or split process is a continuous process. But again, this is not a lexical grammatical continuum. The lexical and grammatical meanings of going to, for instance, are clearly distinct from the beginning. It's motion or intention on the one hand and future on the other hand. And they're distinct from the very beginning. There's no continuum between them. The fourth, I skipped the third continuum, but the fourth continuum is the lexicon syntax continuum. And this is, of course, a central element in much user-based linguistics, including construction grammar. And I'm completely convinced that there's a lexicon syntax continuum. So you can, on the one hand of this continuum, you have fully concrete idioms, for instance, break a leg. And on the other hand, you have fully schematic constructions where there's no concrete material in them. For instance, the VNP-PP, coarse motion construction. And in the middle, you have some mixed cases where you have more or less schematic construction. So here you have some concrete elements, but also an empty slot, which can be filled by an NP. And down here you have also some concrete elements and some empty slots. So these are partially schematic constructions. But this continuum between fully concrete and fully schematic is not a lexical grammatical continuum, I would argue. So firstly, note that continua are compatible with cutoff points. So it's also in football, it's the process by which a ball crosses the goal line is a continuous process, but this does not exclude that we can be precise about when it has actually resulted in a goal. So continue do not necessarily exclude cutoff points. Now, secondly, the lexical grammatical distinction is superimposed on the lexicon syntax continuum, like this. So on the top here, we have lexical elements, and on the bottom, we have grammatical elements. And this is because on the top, we have elements like break a leg that can be modified. And in pull somebody's leg, we can still modify. We can, for instance, say quickly pull somebody's leg. And this means that we can modify the meaning of the construction. But here we cannot modify them because there are no lexical elements in this schematic construction, in this partially schematic construction. There are only grammatical elements, and this means there's nothing we can modify, and therefore there's nothing of focus. There's nothing lexical, and therefore the construction as a whole here is grammatical, and the same goes for this construction. So fully schematic constructions are grammatical. For instance, the question meaning of interrogative word order is intentionally backgrounded relative to what the question is about, as we already discussed. And partially schematic constructions, on the other hand, may be lexical if they have lexical non-filler parts, for instance, pull in or leg in pull somebody's leg, or grammatical if they only have grammatical non-filler parts. There is no lexical grammatical continuum. If grammaticalization is considered as at the basic meaning level of analysis, it's clear that there's no intermediate position between lexical and grammatical, not even in those delexicalization cases where you take a lexical element and then develop a grammatical element. So here in this, in the development of English going into gonna, because if we look at it at the basic level of meaning, then there's already from the very beginning, there's a distinction between motion or intention, the lexical meaning of going, and the future meaning that is implied not by going, but by the construction with a purposive infinitive. The future meaning and the lexical meaning are distinct from the very beginning. There's no continuum between them. Okay, so the basic insight is that lexicon and grammar are not distinct types of phenomena, but basically the same type of phenomenon, namely conventionalized meanings and signs. This is fully compatible with usage-based linguistics. There's no principle in usage-based linguistics that precludes a distinction between subtypes of conventionalized meanings and signs. So I think this is compatible with usage-based linguistics. But of course, this does not mean that it is always an easy empirical task to decide whether a given element is lexical or grammatical. I do not claim that I have solved all empirical problems here. So now I will spend the last 7 minutes on talking about the raison d'etre of grammar. Why do we have grammar? And key questions for understanding why we have grammar are these. What does grammar do for us? Is grammar unique to humankind? Is grammar unique to language at all? Are there alternatives to grammar? Can we do without grammar? And why do all natural languages develop grammar? And in other words, what drives grammaticalization? All these questions can be straightforwardly answered by based on our new theory. And I'll go quite quickly through this. So what does grammar do for us? We already talked about this. It helps us coordinate linguistic attention. It helps us decide which part of a linguistic message to direct our attention towards. But this does not mean, okay, so that's a clear function of grammar. It's really helpful for us, but this does not mean that grammar was designed for or otherwise driven by this function. So grammar can have this nice function for us without actually, this does not entail that grammar was motivated by this function. And I'll get back to this towards the end. The second question is grammar unique to humankind? Well, let's first consider the great apes. In a recent study, it was shown that if you look at their gestures, there's no evidence of syntax. They have around 70 to 80 gestures in nature, bonobos, I think, but there's no evidence of syntax. But then people have also started talking about sound combinations, but it's clear that the apes can have frequent sound combinations without having grammar. We also have frequent combinations of activities without having grammar. For instance, there's a much higher likelihood that I will put my right leg forward when I have just put my left leg forward than the likelihood that I put my right leg forward without having put my left leg forward. So it's not, when studying ape language, it's not enough just to find frequent sequences. You also have to be specific about what exactly is grammar. Otherwise, everything becomes grammar. So, is grammar unique to humankind? Well, if grammar is understood as an inventory of elements that are attentionally backgrounded, it is pretty clear that apes and other animals do not have anything like grammar. Apes do not have an inventory of elements that are attentionally backgrounded. I'm pretty sure that this is not likely. They may have a capacity for combination that is similar to universal grammar or merge. This is what the discussion is all about. But if we look more precisely at what grammar, we're discussing this on the premises made by the generativist. But if we instead discuss it based on a user-space theory of what grammar is, it's pretty clear that apes do not have grammar. This does not mean that grammar is essential to human beings. So the fact that we only human beings have grammar does not mean that grammar is essential to human beings. So here I'm in line with Tomasello, who would say that grammaticalization is to some extent a sophistication and is culturally transmitted. We can then ask, is grammar unique to language? Language, not language. The discussion here has been focused on neurocognitive aspects. So all science is it's as if neurocognitive discussions are sort of the ultimate arguments. So people have discussed this issue in terms of the distinction between domain-specific or domain-general capacities or abilities. If instead we look at the issue in another way, namely from a functional user-space point of view, and if grammar is understood as an inventory of elements that are essentially backgrounded, it is pretty clear that grammar is not unique to language. So if we don't look at where things go on in the head, but instead of look at what are the functions of grammar, what does grammar do for us, then we can see that we can do similar things in other communication systems outside language. And to some example of this we have already seen. In painting, we can use, for instance, dark color to signal background information. This is a conventional means for indicating background information. It's outside language, but it's completely similar to what grammar does, in my view. In traffic tables here, you can see the red triangles. They signal that this is a warning, so this is background information. And then you could argue that the trains and the pedestrian here, they are lexical information. They are the potential foreground of these warnings. And even in music, it has also been shown that even in very simple rhythms, in 1, 2, very simple 4-beat rhythms, we make an attentional prioritization such that we automatically pay more attention to beat number 1 and 3 than to beat number 2 and 4, the off beats. And this has been shown in I think it was an ERP study. Give the reference here. So outside language, we have other systems for directing attention to complex messages. So grammar is not unique to language based on this. Are there alternatives to grammar? Yes, based on our theory, we can say that there are alternative ways of communicating background meaning. For instance, we can have context-guided background inferencing, as in I'm going in order to resign with a purposive infinitive. We can have contextually backgrounded lexical meaning. Did you begin smoking or did you begin smoking? Here you can play, you have two verbs, namely begin and smoke, and then you can play which of these verbs should win the competition for attention. If smoke wins again and again, or if begin loses again and again, in other words, then begin can give rise to grammaticalization, can be conventionalized as a so-called inceptive marker. Then you can have constructionally backgrounded lexical meaning. For instance, you can have things that you can place elements in parenthetical clauses. It is good, my friend thinks. And of course, you can then finally ignore the meaning at hand. So speakers of languages without obligatory tense marking will have to infer temporal reference in cases where it's required, but elsewhere they may simply ignore time issues. So you can simply ignore the background meaning. You don't need it always. So can we do without grammar? Yes, we can also do without grammar to some extent at least, and this talk will be finished in a couple of minutes. So firstly, we can find telegraphic speech in agrammatic aphasia, also in old telegrams, in tweets, at least when there was a sign limit, in headlines, in early Chinese language, in pidgin language, in basic variety, second language, etc. In all these cases are cases of language where there's little, if any, grammar. And we've already seen an example of this, and I give it here again, of agrammatic aphasic speech. Secondly, David Gill has argued that even our natural languages, even among natural languages, we have languages that are relatively devoid of grammar. They have very little grammar. So he sets up this ideal language that is morphologically isolating. It has no word internal morphological structure. It is syntactically monocategorical. That is, there are no syntactic categories. There's no distinction between nouns and verbs, for instance. They're semantically associative. There's no semantic structure. It's not that we don't know which element modifies another element. And then he claims that, for instance, Riau Indonesian is a language that is to some extent has these properties. And he even claims that also standard Indonesian actually has, you don't need much grammar in standard Indonesian to have a perfect, complex modern society. So also David Gill's argument here stresses the argument I just made. It says that even in natural languages, we don't perhaps need much grammar. But this, of course, raises the question, why then, if we don't need it really, why then do all natural languages develop grammar? What drives grammaticalization? And I'll just answer this very briefly. So is there a functional conspiracy here? Is it the case that something drives grammaticalization, that there's something that drags grammaticalization? Do we need grammar for something? Is that what drives grammaticalization? I think there's no functional conspiracy. I think the grammatical elements grammar is simply the result of conventionalization of recurring attentional asymmetries in language usage. So because we have complex language, we make like these avoid swimming. We make these context-dependent attentional asymmetries, and some of these become conventionalized, and this is what creates grammar. So attentional asymmetries are themselves a result of the clash between complex information unfolding in time and limited processing resources. This is what attention is all about. So this means that grammar is a consequence of the need for attentional prioritization that arises both philo and ontogenetically in the transition from holophrastic signs like ma for the small kid to complex signs like mommy take me up. The rise of complex meanings and signs depends on a capacity for combination along the lines that Chomsky has proposed, but is likely motivated not the way Chomsky thinks, but by the transition from situational to conceptual meaning, as Terence Deacon has proposed. So this is my answer to this question. The bonus question is, do AI bots have grammar? Well, clearly they don't have grammar. They simply simulate grammar. And what is more interesting is that they may not even need grammar because they do not have the processing limitations we do have. Their working memory, their processing resources are much bigger than our processing resources. And perhaps this explains why there are several examples that two AI bots have developed their own language in order to communicate more effectively, efficiently than when they communicated in English, for instance. And it would be very interesting to know what this AI bot language, which structure that it has. Maybe it's not at all to do with attentional prioritization. Okay, that's it. My final point here is that grammar is in the background, just like Velasquez, the painter of the painting. But without the background, of course, you don't get the full picture. So background is important. And that's it. Thank you very much for attending. And I'm sorry I went a little over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boye. Thank you for your inspiring speech for about 1.5 hours. That is quite long, and everything I think is very interesting and attractive to our audience. So before we start the Q&A sessions, let me make a brief summary of the speech. And in this talk, Professor Boyle outlined a usage-based series of what grammar is. And it is centered on the claim that grammar consists of meaning, morphemes, words, and constructions that are conventionalized and cognitively entrenched as attentionally backgrounded. So, in the perspective of this series, and it's give us a chance to rethink what is grammaticalization and what is agrammatism, and also Professor Boyle gave us several example of experiments that can support this theories, including language perception and language productions and so on. So at the end of the talks, Professor back to the very beginning and answer that question. So why is this question, what is grammar, so important to our understanding of language? And also it is unique to human, unique to language, or do it has other application, and how it shape our view, and how we shape our view of language, and how we see the process, the diachronic process of grammaticalizations. So thank you very much, Professor Boyle. So let's move on to the discussion sections.
Thanks for the nice summary. Impressive.
You're welcome. And since now we have Zoom, we have about 57 audience in Zoom, and then we also have another meeting room at a Chinese application Tencent meetings. So audience from Tencent meeting and their question will be types in the chat box. And if anyone here in Zoom have any questions to discuss with Professor Boyle, please just open your microphone and also open the camera.
Hello. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I think my camera has a problem because well, it's not very important. I wanted to thank you, Professor Boye, for your very interesting presentation. And I wanted to take advantage of this time with a lot of Chinese linguists. I have to admit, I do not know Chinese. I have a very limited understanding of it and of its functioning, but I know that it is considered to be a language that is less grammatical in a sense than many European languages. And what Professor Boye said during the last part of his presentation, notably about AI bots not needing that much grammar because they have such enormous processing memory, would it be similar to the genesis of the Chinese language, where not much grammar was needed because the scholars just thought of as collective processing memory and not individual processing memory? If that makes sense, I may have been a bit vague.
Thank you, guys. I think it's a very, very good question. So the question is, because I mean, in contrast to generative grammar, which insists that all languages have the same inborn, innate structure, then I would say, based on this, I would say that it's perfectly possible that you can have completely you can have languages that have less grammar and languages that have more grammar. It's simply a matter of putting so there's a trade-off between different ways of conveying background information. You can convey it lexically, as I said, you can convey it by means of inferencing. So it could be that languages with relatively less grammar, they simply rely more on inferencing, or they rely more on contextual cues. There's some, and then regarding specifically Chinese, so Chinese is without doubt the oldest, one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And if they had, which is sometimes claimed in classical Chinese, they had little morphological grammar, then according to my theory, this is perfectly there's no surprise here. It's simply the case that Chinese exploits other means for this attentional prioritization that I talked about. Yeah, I think that's perfectly possible. And this is a David Gill's point. So he says that it's perfectly possible to run Indonesia, which is, after all, 200-300 million inhabitants. You can run that basically without grammar. And I tend to agree with him. Yes, I would agree with this. There's some other ways. There's some interesting studies by Walter Beihang, professor of linguistics in Mainz in Germany, who's also an expert of Chinese, and he recently showed, together with Professor Lin Sun from Wuhan University, the agricultural, I forgot which university in Wuhan, a university in Wuhan. He showed that Chinese speakers are faster at making inferences when it comes to pronoun resolution than German speakers, where the German speakers get more information in the pronouns, grammatical information in the pronouns. The Chinese speakers are are faster than at making inferences. So there's this trade-off between getting things by the code or getting it by inferencing, for instance. That's what I could.
Thank you very much. Can you put the sorry, can you put the names in the chat, please?
Yes, I can. If I can, yeah. If I can find it here. Let's see if it's gone. Let's see what I can do. There you are. Here.
Hello, Professor Boye.
Yes.
In your discussion, you mentioned Lantermi, and in your reference, I didn't see the which reference you have cited, and what is Lantermi's contribution to the theoretical background of your research? And I remember he is among if he's not the first one, then he is among the very few cognitive linguists who studied attention studied the attention under the open class and the closed class. And yeah, could you discuss a little bit about this?
Also a brilliant question. Maybe I can go down here. So I think that I think that Lentelmi has sort of made a map of all the different areas of language where attention plays a role. So in this paper, I think this is in his paper in, I forgot, I can send you the reference later. I think it's simply called attention phenomena.
Yeah, this chapter is not in the two-volume set, right?
No,
Correct.
no,
Yeah.
I don't think so. No, no. But he has written about it in several places. But he has a big catalog of attention phenomena. It's from 2011 or 2012, and it's called
And
Attention Phenomena. And it's from
so,
a Oxford University handbook. So there are several. So one attention phenomena that is also discussed. I'm more familiar with Langegaard's work. So one attention phenomenon that is discussed in terms of Langegaard when he talks about discourse prominence or attention phenomena is the distinction between profile and base. So if you have
right.
the notion of radius, I think that's one of his examples. It presupposes the concept of radius presupposes, but backgrounds the concept of
Yeah.
circle. And then there's also the trajectory figure or the landmark ground distinction, which is discussed both by Langegaard and Talmy, which is also an attentional asymmetry. But so I'm just saying that what is relevant to the lexical grammatical distinction is one of these types of attentional asymmetries. So there are lots of types of attentional asymmetries. What I'm after is the attentional asymmetry between different parts of the same message. So this is one way in which I relate. So I basically build on all Talmud's work on attention, and then I say one of these types is relevant also to language.
Yeah. But I
To
think,
understand grammar. And then you're completely right. Then he says that closed classes and open classes, closed classes are attentionally backgrounded and open classes are foregrounded. And I think this is wrong in two ways. Firstly, it is wrong because open classes can also have, you can also have lexical elements there. So you can also have
yeah.
foregrounded elements in closed classes. And secondly, it's wrong because if it was there's a conceptual mistake in this argument because if closed classes were always only backgrounded and if open classes were already always foregrounded, then it would be impossible. Grammaticalization would be impossible. It would be impossible for an item to shift from an open class to a closed class because how could it go from foregrounded to backgrounded? There would
Yeah.
be no.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing instead here is that I say that there's the basic link between lexical and grammatical is that grammatical has one of the two statuses. So lexical can be both background and foreground. Grammatical can be only foreground. So there's a natural link between grammatical and lexical status, namely grammatical status arises if you eradicate the potential of being foregrounded. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for asking this. I hope my answer was clear enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's very clear. But uh, I was wondering how to categorize your research. Is that grammaticalization or is that um, cognitive linguistic theory or which area should I classify your research in? It's very
I think
comprehensive.
that's also this is a almost personal question because, and I also like this question very much because I sometimes ask myself the same. So my ambition is to develop a full-fledged theory of grammar that covers everything from basic theory of what grammar is to how grammar develops, and also the neurocognitive aspects of grammar. So I think the basic theory is complete. I think that's in all respects functional usage-based cognitive. It's a cognitive usage-based functional theory.
Okay.
And then I try within functional usage-based cognitive linguistics, I try to develop a theory of what grammar is because I don't think that this theory has been developed. I don't think this has been clear. I think this is missing.
Yeah, yeah, it's clear. So you basically you didn't believe the lexical grammatical continuum.
No.
So if you didn't believe that, then um, a what is the very, very, very earliest stage of language? Is that a lexical and grammatical they develop together, or the lexical first? Or would you ever
I think perfect, very, very nice question. Also, so I think that what happens first is that you don't have anything like lexical and grammatical. You have something, only have what the first things you have are holophrases. Then what you get, the revolution is when you get from holophrases to combine holophrases. So holophrases are signs where you just have one sign in one utterance. And then at some point you start combining these holophrases. And then to begin with, you have what is discussed in the literature as a proto-language. And a proto-language is a language where you have combinations, but no grammatical structure at all. There's no structure at all. So a proto-language is very close to what David Gill, and there's a long way down there, but we can try to find him. He discusses as almost there. So these, what he calls isolating monocategorical associational languages. These are languages with no structure. So there are no lexical categories. There's no structure at all. It's just it's just some words. You cannot call it a lexicon because there are no lexical categories, because lexical categories are really grammatical categories, right? So there are no syntactic categories. There's simply you can simply take two words and put them together. So and there you actually have a fully functional language. You don't need grammar. But then what happens next is that some of the combinations, what you do need now, you do have complexity. So because of complexity, you have attentional asymmetries. Sometimes you focus on one thing, sometimes you focus your attention on another thing. And due to this, if you do that long enough, then you develop conventionalized background information, and then you develop grammar. So I envisage that you first have holophrases, then you combine with no grammar, what you could call a proto-language or an isolating monocategorical associational languages. And then based on that, because you have complexity, you need attentional prioritization, and because you also develop conventions, then you also develop grammar. So that's the phylogenetic story. Thank
So
you.
in the very, very earliest stage of language development, I'll give you one example, something like you said phrases or a few words combined into phrases, but this concerned with the word order. Something like in English or Chinese or English, a big bottle of water, we put the big in front of bottle, but in Spanish, something like una agua grande, put grande after the water. This word order is grammar.
Yes.
Then then the grammar and the lexicon must co-develop together at the very
Yes,
beginning.
yes, I completely agree, fully agree. Grammar and lexicon co-develop because at the proto-language stage, if you only have the stage where there's no syntactic categories, then grammar and lexicon, they represent a division of labor, you could say. A division of labor. So there are two ways, just like lexical categories, they also represent a division of labor. So verbs they take care of the predication, and nouns take care of the entity reference or whatever you would call it, right? So there's a division of labor for the holistic effort you need to make. You divide the labor instead of just acting like a child and say mommy or ma or baba or whatever they say, small kids that don't have any complexity. Then we can divide the complex meaning that they are conveying. Then we can divide that out into different elements. So grammar and lexicon, I completely agree that they develop together. Lexicon only makes sense when you have lexical categories. And lexical categories are based on distributional differences.
Okay, thank you very much. And
And
I
that's
have to
grammar. Yeah.
give the chance to the audience, and I report to you. This is very impressive and insightful lecture and attract a lot of audience. And we have set the room as reported by Jerome. In the Tencent, we have 90 plus participants. And in the Zoom room, we have 60 plus. But in the following days, I suppose there may be over 1,000 to watch your video.
Okay, I'm
Okay,
grateful
Jerome,
for
I
that.
give the opportunity to the audience.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for attending my talk. I'm very pleased and grateful that you are attending and that you haven't, even though it was
Please,
long and
yeah, pleasure
complex.
is ours. Yeah, it's a
Thank
great
you.
pleasure.
I see one audience is waiting. Like, sorry. Mm.
May I ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah, please. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was looking for you.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Boye. And I'm actually now a master degree student in applied linguistics in Mahidol University in Thailand. And actually, I'm now doing the research of Chinese grammaticalization, taking the case of 离合词 separable verbs, this kind of special phenomenon or construct in Chinese language. And now I'm stuck in a kind of thing like how to find a good way or quantitative way to measure the semantic transparency. And like I'm just a MA student, and if I only use if I can use some like the semantic vector method like BERT or some like computational linguistic method, yes, if I'm capable of, I will do that, but I cannot. And I could not find a kind of well-established framework for me to find the prototypical meaning of my target items or target lexemes and yes. I try to use the Haney's categorical metaphor, this kind of theory, like that is developed, it was built on egocentricity, like people how to understand this world from themselves first, like from our body, that is from person, and then to some animals, to some object, and so on and so forth, to space, to time, and then to some qualities, so on and so forth. But I'm wondering whether Haney's 1991 categorical metaphor, this kind of theory can be directly used as a rule or as a ruler to say, I can say like there are two morphemes, and because my targets are all compounds words, I can find there are two morphemes, and I can say go to look them up in dictionary and find them all those items for their meaning in terms of meaning, and then to say if they are if this one of the meaning is about the themselves, about person, so I say that they should be the prototypical one, and then with time they vary or they change themselves from person to quality, because according to Haney's theory, it should be like this. But I wondering, because it is like it can only be used, I think it can only be used as a verification tool. I'm not sure whether my understanding is correct or not. And so, yeah, that's my question.
Thanks for this question. I can't answer it, I'm afraid, because I don't think it's related to what I have. I can't see the relationship with what I've been talking about now. And also, I'm afraid that I'm not familiar with the theory you are talking about, although I do know the reference. So I simply have to. I'm very sorry that I can't help you here, but maybe if you want, we can. I can try to help you if you write me a message afterwards. My um,
Could I
my
contact you via email maybe after this
yes,
session?
please do so, please.
Actually,
Yes,
yes, I want to ask because my supervisor is very busy. He's flying everywhere for international conference, so
yes.
I'm just kind of independent researcher
Yes, I
kind of like
understand.
that.
I understand your situation. This can be very lonely, but I would be happy to see. But I'm not sure. But then I can perhaps direct you towards something else, somebody else who can help you.
Yeah,
I'd be
actually,
happy
it
to
is.
see.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. Actually, it is from Henning Candy, 1991 grammaticalization. Actually, it is a classical.
Then I know what it
Novel.
is. Sorry,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But
But then
because
there was
I'm
something I didn't.
yeah, I'm a MA student. I cannot
I don't know. Uh,
like.
I understand. Yeah. So if it's about as for the relationship between grammaticalization and metaphor,
Yeah.
then there's general agreement, at least since the mid 1990s, that novel metaphor does not involve grammaticalization. So there are
Yes.
few theories before that where they tried to say that metaphor is also involved in grammaticalization, but if you look at the historical facts, it's never the case. And whenever you can see, okay, there is a case for metaphor involving grammaticalization, then it's actually there are also other possibilities. So there's not a single case I'm aware of a diachronic development where there's only a metaphor, only the metaphorical
So
change can bring
actually,
grammaticalization.
that is what I'm not doubting. Like metaphor, maybe it can only be one possible reason or possible is like we cannot just to take metaphor or categorical metaphor as the only solution to this kind of grammaticalization or something like this. So I don't know what to actually do now.
No, but I think so. No, I think if you are, I think my personal opinion, if you're trying to find metaphor, if you're trying to find explain cases of grammaticalization in terms of metaphor, then I think you're on the wrong track.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
That's the best, but and I think this is the general this is the general attitude in grammaticalization research.
Because my professor, one of his papers in press has used this framework. So
Yeah,
I
yeah, but maybe
try to mimic.
but it has to. I'm only talking about novel metaphor. If you have a dead metaphor, an old metaphor, that could actually give rise to grammaticalization. That's fine with me. But novel metaphor which attracts attention cannot go hand in hand with grammaticalization. That's the only point I'm making. So I'm not excluding that something that originally developed through metaphor can later go develop through grammaticalization.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. I was too slow. I didn't understand your question to begin with.
Sorry to interrupt. And since it's already 9 o'clock, it's 2 hours lectures. It must be a lot of effort and attention for Professor Boyle. So and I still see several questions in the chat box. So sorry I have to interrupt. Maybe later you can email Professor Boyle and for the discussion. And sorry about that. And still, thank you for your question and wonderful discussion. And so we still have several questions from Tencent meeting. And also, Professor Boyle, you can see it in the chat box. And first, does this theory also shed light on the framework of constructionalizations? And this is
Yes, I
first.
do think it does. That's a good question, but I haven't thought about that enough. But for instance, there was something uh, that I skipped I will go back to it. I hope you can still see my you can still see my slides. So
Yes,
the
we can see.
let's see, where is it? Here, syntacticization. So this is one classic case of constructionalization where you go from two juxtaposed clauses. I say that. This is from Faroese. I say that he will come. And then, so here you simply have a cataphoric pronoun that projects the new another clause, and then this grammaticalizes into a construction, into a subordinate construction where you have I say that he will come. So you develop a subordinate construction here. And this is very well known in all the Germanic languages. This is also what happened in English. This is why that, the pronoun is in English the same as that as a complementizer. And I think what this is also on my theory, this is a case of grammaticalization. But this is a case of grammaticalization that is ignored not in construction grammar, but is ignored in much grammaticalization literature, namely the development of new syntactic constructions. So what I think is the case is that what qualifies it as a case of grammaticalization is that you get a new a background function is conventionalized, and I'll try to show you what I mean. So here, what you want to do when, as you say, I say that he will come, then you are trying to say that he will come is a proposition that is an argument of say. But in order to show this, you partly depend on the construction, namely you know that that is the object, is a complement of say. But then you know, okay, what is that? Then you need to rely on inference. And you say, okay, that can only be in the context, it can only be he comes. So here you have the relationship between the predicate and the propositional argument is an inference, partly an inference. It's pragmatic inference. Depends on the relationship between that and he will come. That's a pragmatic inference, pronoun resolution. But when you get the new construction, when you conventionalize the new construction, this, whenever you hear complement construction, in complementation construction in European languages, that you know that the relationship between say and the complement, that's an argument predicate relation. So now this relation becomes conventional. To begin with, it's pragmatic, context dependent, then it becomes conventionalized. And this background relation this function is of course backgrounded. It's not attentionally foregrounded. It's just a helping function that helps us finding out how the different parts of the message are related. So I think that based on this, based on our theory, we can be clear about the relationship between constructionalization and grammaticalization. Thanks for a very good question.
Yeah. And since it's already quite long, so could you please briefly answer I think it's the final questions proposed by Dr. Lee and in the chat box. And first, has the definition of grammar changed in the process from studying agrammatism to grammaticalizations? And second, in the exploration from agrammatism research to grammaticalization, how should we understand grammar, not only as a structural system, but also as a dynamic cognitive and evolutionary process? And this is the final two questions.
These are very tough questions. Could you say the first one again? Sorry.
Sorry. Has the definition of grammar changed in the process from studying grammatism to grammaticalization?
Yeah. In my no, I'm trying to work on working on the basic same definition. I guess I take this question to relate to my own definition. And my own definition is basically the same, but then in a lot of different ways, I have changed my views on different things. For instance, grammaticalization. The idea of grammaticalization is different now from in 2012 when we made our original contribution. But I basically try to address different questions concerning grammar based on the same idea of what grammar is. Thank you for this. I hope this. I'm not sure this answered the question.
Yeah, Dr. Lee have replied in the chat box. I think that's yeah, that's answered her questions. And
Thanks.
thank you all today for the lecture and also the discussion part. And also thanks for our audience and to participant into these lectures. And later the recording will be sent to the COSE account of each platform. So let's call it a day. Thank you very much, Professor Boyle.
Thank you
And
very
also
much. Thank you to
thank
all
you
of
for
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.